Okay, so welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today we're going to be looking into a story that's really kind of blown up about a Delhi High Court judge, um, Justice Yashwant Varma.
Yeah, big story.
Huge story, yeah. Um, and essentially what happened was a large amount of cash was discovered at his residence. And, well, obviously, it's raised a lot of questions about what exactly went down.
Right.
So we're going to be taking a deep dive today into some excerpts from a Times Now YouTube video, the transcript specifically, to try and extract, the key details and try and understand, what happened, what was the reaction, and really consider the implications of all of this for the judiciary. So that's our mission today, bringing you to the heart of the matter, but clearly and quickly as possible.
Straight to it.
Absolutely straight to it.
Mm-hmm.
So what's really fascinating right off the bat is just how unusual the sequence of events that kind of brought this whole thing to light. It wasn't, like an investigation or a targeted raid or anything like that. It was a fire.
A fire.
At Justice Varma's home on March 14th. And they, kind of set off this whole chain reaction.
Yeah. And the reports indicate that he was actually away at the time. So it was his family who called the fire brigade and the police to come to the scene.
So a fire incident, obviously that's concerning enough on its own. But here's the real twist. As the emergency services are doing their job, trying to contain the fire, they discover, get this, a large sum of cash.
Wow.
Inside a storeroom.
Oh.
Yeah, we're not talking about a little bit of money here.
Yeah.
The fact that the local police immediately documented it, they brought it to the attention of higher-ups, government officials. That tells you this was big, this was serious.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is not your average kind of thing you just stumble upon, right? And I think the fact that it triggered such a fast response from the highest levels of the judiciary kind of speaks volumes about, the weight of this discovery. The Chief Justice of India, Sanjeev Khanna himself, convened an immediate and super urgent meeting of the Supreme Court Collegium. Now, for those who may not be, familiar with the term, the Collegium is this body that's basically responsible for, appointments, transfers within the higher judiciary. So the fact that they got involved so quickly, so urgently, really just underscores how seriously they were taking this.
Yeah, and their reaction was pretty swift. They decided to transfer Justice Varma back to his parent high court in Allahabad, where he served, before he came to the Delhi High Court back in October 2021. And, on the surface, a transfer might sound like, just a routine administrative thing.
Yeah.
But the transcript suggests it wasn't exactly a unanimous decision.
Right. You get the sense that there was some real back and forth within the Collegium. Apparently, some members had serious concerns that just transferring him wouldn't be enough. They were really worried about, what kind of message this sends, about the judiciary's credibility, public trust, all of that. And that internal debate, I think, is super revealing, right? It really speaks to just how big a deal this is.
Yeah.
Why were some members so hesitant about just a transfer? Maybe they felt that just moving him wouldn't really address those deeper questions raised by finding, such a large sum of cash, unexplained cash.
Makes sense. So the transfer did happen, but obviously big questions remain about whether that's enough, whether that's, a sufficient response. And so this kind of leads us to, the procedures that are already in place. What kind of rules are there when there are complaints, concerns about a sitting judge? What's the system for dealing with something like this?
Well, I think the starting point is that the Chief Justice of India has the power to basically ask the judge for an explanation. What's going on?
Right.
And if the CJI and the Collegium aren't satisfied with that explanation, they can actually set up a special committee, an in-house inquiry committee, to dig into the matter further.
Yeah, and the potential consequences, I mean, they're not, they're pretty serious.
Mm-hmm.
The transcript even mentioned that in cases of, serious misconduct, the CGI could actually ask the judge to resign.
Right.
And they even touch on, the possibility of initiating a removal process. Could you kind of break down that process for us?
Sure. So, we often hear the term impeachment, right, in other contexts. But when we're talking about high court judges in India, the Constitution uses the term removal. And this whole process of removing a judge, it's a pretty involved thing, requires a lot of support, a majority vote from both houses of parliament. Plus, you need a 2/3 majority of the members who are present and actually voting in each house. So it's not a simple thing. It's not a quick thing.
Right. It's a much higher bar. Okay, so let's kind of rewind for a second and look at the sequence of events immediately after that fire.
Yeah.
Right. Because, the Times Now legal editor, they actually gave us a pretty detailed timeline,
Okay.
which is helpful in seeing how this unfolded.
Yeah.
So it seems that around 11:30 p.m. on March 14th, the security guards, they saw smoke. They're like, okay, something's up. They alerted the police.
Right. Right.
And what's interesting here is that initially they categorized the fire as minor. So they just sent, a couple of fire tenders. It wasn't like this huge blaze or anything. But it was during the process of putting out that relatively small fire that they stumbled upon the cache.
Just by chance.
Totally unexpected, right?
Yeah.
So, of course, the fire department, they follow their procedures. They inform their, senior officials who in turn contact the local police station. And from there, it just kind of snowballs. Senior police, they whip up a report. Top officials are briefed. The Home Ministry gets involved.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, the government reaches out to the CJI, which is what leads to that super urgent, collegium meeting, and then the decision to transfer Justice Varma.
Yeah, yeah. And, the transcript also mentions something kind of interesting about Justice Varma's, professional past. They use the term like checkered career. And they point to a past FIR that was related to a banking fraud at a sugar cooperative. So that was back in 2018. But it's worth noting that he had actually resigned from the cooperative before that FIR was even filed. So, it's more information, it's context. But how much it actually relates to the current situation, that's still unclear.
Yeah, it's another layer to this whole story.
Right.
And I think, it really brings us back to the big question. Is just transferring him enough? Is that a sufficient response?
Yeah.
And the legal experts quoted in the transcript, they seem to be leaning towards no.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of them feel that more action is needed, maybe even suspending him from judicial work while they conduct a, full-blown inquiry.
Okay.
And, as we said before, it all comes down to protecting the integrity of the judiciary, right? Making sure the public still has faith in the system.
Absolutely, yeah. Because at the end of the day, the judiciary's power, it comes from the people's trust. And allegations like this, even if they turn out to be unfounded, they can really, really damage that trust if they're not handled properly, With transparency and with a sense that, they're taking this seriously. And I think that's why we're hearing from so many legal voices saying, look, it's not enough to just move him to a different court.
Right. Absolutely. So beyond the transfer, I mean, what other options are there? We've talked about the CJI asking for an explanation. You mentioned a potential in-house inquiry. What else is on the table here?
Well, there's also the possibility of, the CJI actually asking Justice Varma to resign.
Okay.
Or even suspending him, pending the outcome of any investigation. And,
Right.
and of course, there's the whole formal process of removing him through Parliament. But as we talked about, that's a long and complex process. It's not something that happens overnight. And I think it's interesting, that Justice Varma actually took leave from the Delhi High Court on the very day this whole thing broke.
Oh, wow.
That's definitely added fuel to the fire, so to speak.
Yeah, people are going to read into that for sure.
Absolutely.
And obviously, a story like this is going to trigger a lot of reactions. And the political world definitely took notice. I mean, the transcript highlighted concerns from, the Congress, the RJD. They're really stressing the importance of public faith in the judiciary.
Right, yeah.
And they're calling for transparency, especially about how much cash was actually found. And there's even been suggestions that Parliament should be officially briefed on the whole situation.
Yeah. I mean, these political responses are really interesting because they show us, how this whole thing has kind of ripple effects. It's not just an internal judicial matter.
Right.
And when you have questions being raised about, whether a case has even been formally registered to legally seize the money, I mean, that just adds this whole other layer of legal complexity to everything.
Absolutely. And we also saw that, Rajya Sabha MP, Kapil Sibal, really respected senior advocate. He weighed in as well. And he really emphasized how serious this is, talking about corruption within the judiciary. And he actually advocated for a more transparent process for how judges are appointed in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. Sabal is basically connecting this specific event to these bigger ongoing conversations about accountability within the judiciary, about the appointment process itself. And, there was some criticism early on about the collegium silence, right? Some people felt like, hey, they need to say something. They need to address this, that not speaking up was almost sending the wrong message.
Yeah, I can see that. And then you had some really strong words from a former chief information commissioner.
Oh, right.
They just flat out said that transferring Justice Varma is certainly not adequate. And they called for his immediate suspension. They even went so far as to suggest that there should be a parliamentary report within a week, And they really connected the dots between the delays that we often see in the justice system.
Right.
And how that can actually allow corruption to thrive.
Yeah, that's a really powerful statement from someone who, is coming from outside the current system, but it's a voice that I think carries a lot of weight.
Yeah.
And it highlights the need for action, swift action, if they want to restore public confidence. And the point about, delays creating opportunities for corruption, I think that's something we really need to think about.
Absolutely. And one of the reactions that really struck me in the transcript was from this senior lawyer who described the situation as a very black day for the judiciary.
It's a strong statement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the analogy they used was really powerful. They compared transferring the judge to just moving like a problematic general manager within the same hotel chain.
Oh.
Just shuffling them around.
Mm-hmm.
And it really drives home this feeling that, just moving the person doesn't address the problem.
Exactly. Yeah. Just changing their location doesn't make the issue go away.
Exactly. And this lawyer also brought up a scenario that I think is really troubling. They said, what if Justice Varma ends up hearing corruption cases while he's still under suspicion?
Oh,
I mean, it undermines the whole idea of justice.
Yeah,
right?
it would be a very bad look. I mean, it would really make a mockery of the whole system. And the lawyer, they really emphasize that public trust is the foundation. It's the bedrock of the judiciary. And by extension, it's the foundation of our whole democracy.
Right.
So they're really hoping that the CJI and the Collegium will reconsider, their initial decision, that they'll take stronger action to set a clear example because, the stakes are really high.
Yeah, absolutely. And to kind of put this whole thing in perspective, the Times Now W report, they bring up a case from 2008, the, quote, infamous cash at door scam
Oh, yeah, yeah.
involving Justice Nurul Kar of the Punjab and Haryana High Court. And, while the details are different, it's kind of an interesting point of comparison.
Absolutely.
So remind us what happened in that case.
Yeah, so basically in that case, a packet of money containing like 15 lakh rupees, it was accidentally delivered to Justice Nirmal Kaur's residence.
Okay.
And she did the right thing. She reported it, and the CBI ended up investigating. But here's the twist. Apparently, the money wasn't even meant for her.
Okay.
It was actually intended for another judge, Justice Nirmal Yadav, just because of a mix-up by the person who was delivering it.
Oh, wow.
So it was a case of mistaken identity. But still, 15 lakhs shows up at a judge's door. That's going to raise some eyebrows.
Right.
And what's striking about that 2008 case is how long it took for anything to happen.
Yeah.
Charges were finally filed against Justice Nirmal Yadav, but not until 2021 by a special CBI court. So that's a long time, and it really highlights how slow these investigations can be when it comes to, members of the judiciary.
Yeah, that really underscores, I think, the challenges that the judiciary faces in policing its own, right, and how long these things can drag on. And that quote that they mentioned, Caesar's wife must be above suspicion, that really sticks with you when we're talking about, the ethical standards expected of those who are supposed to uphold the law.
It's a good quote. I mean, the perception of integrity, it's everything in these cases.
Right, right.
And it kind of brings us to a really important point about transparency, because there's been a lot of calls for more openness in this whole situation. And Supreme Court lawyer Indira Jaising, she actually urged the collegium to come out and say exactly how much money was recovered. Just put it out there.
Yeah.
Stop the speculation. Be upfront with the public. I think that's a pretty reasonable request.
Oh, absolutely. Because when there's a lack of information, rumors start to fly. People start to make their own assumptions. Yeah. And that just further erodes that trust that we were talking about.
Exactly.
So, giving people the facts, being clear about how much cash was actually involved.
Yeah.
That would be a big step towards addressing those concerns.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, just to kind of bring it all together, the key takeaways here. You have a Delhi High Court judge. He's been transferred. This came after the discovery of a substantial amount of cash at his home. And this happened, after a fire.
Right.
So this whole incident has sparked, huge reactions from the legal world, from politicians.
Absolutely.
And it raises some really, really serious questions about judicial integrity, about whether the initial response, was enough.
Yeah. I mean, this is clearly a story that's still unfolding. And there's a lot of layers to it.
Yeah.
Right? We've looked at the timeline. We've talked about the immediate consequences, what legal options are available, the reactions from all the different players, that case from 2008.
Right.
So it's a lot to process.
It is.
And I think it leaves us with a really important question to ponder.
Yeah.
What does all of this tell us about the systems that we have in place within the Indian judiciary, right? Those internal checks and balances. What does this say about the faith that people have in the justice system as a whole? And I think for all of us listening, the important question is, what questions should we be asking as this story continues to develop?
What are the next steps?
What are the next steps?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time.